On March 23, 2021, at approximately 7:30 in the morning, the largest container ship in the world ran aground in the narrowest section of the Suez Canal. The Ever Given, 400 meters long and nearly 60 meters wide, turned sideways and buried its bow in one bank and its stern in the other. A single ship, a single moment, and for 6 days, the world stopped. More than 400 vessels piled up on both ends of the canal, carrying everything from crude oil to livestock to consumer electronics. The cost to global trade has been estimated at between $6 and $10 billion per day. That is roughly $416 million per hour. The backlog of ships took weeks to clear even after the canal reopened. Supply chains that had been running on precise schedules suddenly had no schedule at all. But here is what the Ever Given truly revealed. It did not create a new vulnerability. It exposed one that had been quietly hiding in plain sight for more than 150 years. A man-made ditch through the Egyptian desert, 993 kilometers long, that carries roughly 12% of all world trade and has been the pivot point of global power for more than a century. A canal that empires have fought over, nations have gone to war for, and that today remains as irreplaceable as it was the day it opened. This is the Suez Canal. And its story is not simply a story about ships. To understand what the Suez Canal is, you first have to understand what existed before it. Before 1869, any ship sailing from Europe to Asia had only one route. It had to travel south along the African coast, round the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of the continent, and then north again into the Indian Ocean. The journey from London to Mumbai covered roughly 20,000 kilometers. It could take 4 to 6 months. Ships were lost to storms at the Cape. Cargo rotted. Sailors died. The Isthmus of Suez, the narrow strip of land connecting Africa to Asia, had been recognized for millennia as the natural point where a canal could cut that journey dramatically. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs built canals in the region connecting the Nile to the Red Sea. The Romans maintained them. The Arabs improved them. But for centuries, no one managed to build a waterway directly connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea across the desert itself. The idea was so compelling and the difficulties so formidable that Napoleon Bonaparte ordered a survey of the isthmus during his Egyptian campaign in 1798. His engineers returned with an alarming conclusion. The Red Sea was 10 meters higher than the Mediterranean. If a canal were cut, the resulting flood would be catastrophic. The conclusion was wrong, a fundamental surveying error, but it was enough to kill the project for another half-century. The man who finally cut through the desert was Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat who had cultivated relationships with Egyptian rulers during years of service in Alexandria and Cairo. In 1854, he secured permission from Said Pasha, the Ottoman viceroy of Egypt, to form a company and build the canal. Construction began on April 25, 1859. What followed was one of the largest construction projects in human history and one of the most brutal. At first, workers dug by hand with picks and shovels because the French provided no machinery. More than 1 million Egyptians, mostly peasants conscripted from their villages, were put to work in the desert under conditions of extreme hardship. The heat was relentless. Fresh water had to be brought in from the Nile by specially constructed canals and later by railway. Disease was constant. A cholera epidemic swept through the workforce. Labor disputes and technical complications meant the canal ran 4 years behind schedule. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser made his famous nationalization speech in 1956, he cited a figure that has been contested but never fully refuted. Approximately 120,000 workers died over the course of the project. On November 17, 1869, the Suez Canal was officially inaugurated. The opening ceremony was one of the most lavish events of the 19th century. Egypt's ruler, Khedive Ismail, had spent the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars inviting royalty, heads of state, and dignitaries from across the world. French Empress Eugénie, wife of Napoleon III, led the flotilla of ceremonial vessels through the canal in the procession of honor. The composer Giuseppe Verdi was commissioned to write a new opera for the occasion, though Ada was not completed in time for the opening and premiered 2 years later in Cairo. The canal was decorated with lights. Fireworks lit the desert night, and the world understood, even then, that something fundamental had changed. It was only 25 feet deep when it opened, narrow enough that fewer than 500 ships passed through in its first full year of operation. It had been built at a cost of 433 million francs, and it immediately transformed the world. The voyage from London to Mumbai shrank from 20,000 kilometers to 11,000. The journey time dropped from months to weeks. The commercial implications were staggering. British merchants, who had previously struggled to compete with goods produced closer to Asian markets, suddenly had a decisive advantage. Trade between Europe and Asia surged. The canal paid for itself within years and then kept paying, year after year, decade after decade, generating wealth for whoever held the keys to its gates. Britain moved quickly to claim those keys. When Egypt went bankrupt in 1875, the British government purchased the Egyptian government's entire share in the Suez Canal Company, making Britain its largest single shareholder overnight. The purchase cost the British government £4 million. Over the following decades, the canal became the central artery of the British Empire, the route along which Indian cotton, East Asian tea, Australian wool, and Persian Gulf oil flowed back to the factories and consumers of the United Kingdom. To control the canal was to control the empire. The British kept troops in the canal zone continuously for the next 80 years. The canal did not merely carry commercial goods, it carried the military power that held the British Empire together. When a crisis erupted in India, or a rebellion broke out in Africa, or a conflict emerged in Asia, British reinforcements traveled by the Suez route. The speed advantage over the Cape route was so decisive that the canal effectively multiplied the reach of the Royal Navy, allowing Britain to project military power to the far corners of the empire faster than any rival power could match. Winston Churchill understood this clearly. In both world wars, control of the canal zone was treated as a matter of existential importance. During the Second World War, the Battle of El Alamein in 1942 was fought in the Egyptian desert, partly to prevent German and Italian forces from reaching the canal. Had they succeeded, the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf to Allied forces in Europe and Asia would have been severed. The entire course of the war might have been different. The canal has been closed 5 times in its history. Each closure was a crisis. Each one sent shockwaves through the global economy and reshaped the political order in ways that reached far beyond Egypt. When the canal closes, the ships have to go somewhere. They go around Africa. The Cape of Good Hope route adds roughly 7,000 kilometers to a voyage from the Persian Gulf to Rotterdam, and between 10 and 14 days of sailing time. The additional fuel alone costs approximately $1 million per voyage for a large vessel. Insurance premiums adjust accordingly. Port schedules at both ends are disrupted because ships arrive late, which means they depart late, which means the next cargo is delayed, which means the disruption cascades through every supply chain connected to that vessel. A canal closure is not simply a detour. It is a compression of every inefficiency in global logistics into a single, highly visible economic shock. The most consequential closure came in 1956, and it began not with guns, but with a speech. On July 26 of that year, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser stood before a crowd in Alexandria and announced that he was nationalizing the Suez Canal Company. Egypt would now own and operate the canal. The revenues that had flowed to French and British shareholders for nearly 90 years would henceforth flow to the Egyptian state and fund the construction of the Aswan High Dam. The speech was electrifying across the Arab world and catastrophic in the capitals of Europe. Britain, France, and Israel devised a secret military plan to retake the canal. On October 29, 1956, Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula. Britain and France, under the pretext of protecting the canal, landed troops at Port Said 3 days later. Egyptian aircraft were destroyed on the ground. British paratroopers seized strategic positions along the waterway. What happened next changed the world. The United States, furious at not having been consulted, and alarmed at the spectacle of its European allies conducting what looked like old-fashioned colonial military intervention, applied enormous financial pressure on Britain. The Soviet Union threatened to intervene on Egypt's side. The United States made clear it would not defend sterling if the British government continued the operation. With the pound under speculative attack and the economy in serious difficulty, Britain had no choice but to halt the invasion and withdraw. France and Israel followed. The Suez Crisis did not simply end a military adventure. It announced, with unmistakable clarity, that the age of European imperial power was over. Britain's global prestige never fully recovered. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in January 1957, his health broken. Egypt retained the canal and has operated it ever since. Nasser became the most celebrated leader in the Arab world, and the United States and Soviet Union emerged from the crisis as the undisputed superpowers of the new order. What made the 1956 crisis so historically remarkable was that it was the United States, Britain's closest ally, that delivered the fatal blow. Eisenhower was furious not simply because he opposed the military adventure, but because he feared it was handing the Soviet Union a propaganda victory of incalculable value. The USSR was simultaneously suppressing the Hungarian Revolution that autumn, sending tanks into Budapest to crush a popular uprising. Eisenhower believed that if the United States allowed its allies to be seen conducting what looked like colonial warfare in Egypt at exactly the same moment, the moral distinction between the Western Alliance and the Soviet bloc would collapse in the eyes of the developing world. He chose to sacrifice Britain's prestige to preserve America's. The lesson for every government watching was clear. In the New World Order, the Canal Zone was no longer in Europe's sphere of influence. In warfare, it belonged to the era of superpower competition, and in that competition, the old imperial powers of France and Britain were no longer the decisive voices. The canal itself was blocked for 5 months. Its northern entrance, sealed by ships Egypt had deliberately sunk to prevent British forces from advancing. When it finally reopened in 1957, it was under Egyptian control, generating revenues that went to Cairo rather than Paris and London. A century of European domination over one of the world's most strategic waterways had ended in less than 3 months. 10 years later, it closed again. Following the Six-Day War of 1967 and Israel's occupation of the Sinai Peninsula, the canal became the front line between Egyptian and Israeli forces. For 8 years, from 1967 to 1975, 14 vessels caught inside the canal when hostilities began remained trapped, unable to move in either direction. Their crews eventually rotated out. The ships themselves, covered in desert sand and salt deposits, became known as the Yellow Fleet. The story of those 14 ships is one of the strangest chapters in maritime history. Their crews organized themselves into a floating community. They held regular sporting competitions on their decks, set up postal services between ships, and created a kind of improvised society suspended in a canal that had become a no-man's land. The German vessel Münsterland organized particularly elaborate social events. The ships traded supplies and assisted one another through mechanical problems. 8 years is a long time to wait in the middle of a desert waterway while a geopolitical crisis resolves itself around you. When the canal finally reopened in 1975, only 2 of the 14 vessels were still seaworthy enough to make the passage under their own power. The rest had to be towed out. The canal that reopened in 1975 was a very different waterway from the one that had closed in 1967. Egypt had invested heavily in expansion. Successive widening and deepening projects have continued to the present day, culminating in the 2015 opening of a second parallel channel on part of the canal's length, allowing simultaneous transit in both directions and significantly increasing capacity. Today, the Suez Canal is 193 kilometers long, approximately 24 meters deep, and 205 meters wide in most of its extent. On a normal day before the Red Sea crisis that began in late 2023, approximately 50 ships transited the canal every 24 hours. The peak year was 2023, when more than 26,000 vessels made the passage. The canal generates approximately $300 million in toll revenues every month in normal operation and stands as one of Egypt's most important sources of foreign currency alongside tourism and remittances from Egyptians working abroad. But the canal's significance cannot be measured only by the ships that use it. It must also be measured by what happens when they stop. The Ever Given grounding of 2021 lasted only 6 days, but its consequences echoed through global supply chains for months. Deliveries of everything from medical equipment to flat-pack furniture were delayed. Car factories in Europe halted production because components had not arrived. Retailers faced empty shelves for seasonal goods that had missed their window. Freight rates on the Asia to Europe route surged by 500% in the month of March 2021 compared to the previous year. A single ship, sideways in a ditch, had managed to compress the vulnerabilities of the entire globalized economy into a single visible moment. The Houthi crisis that began in November 2023 was something far more sustained and far more damaging. When Houthi forces in Yemen began attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea in response to Israel's military operations in Gaza, the effect on the Suez Canal was immediate and severe. Areza Didwan's word. Major shipping lines, one by one, suspended their Red Sea services and began routing vessels around the Cape of Good Hope instead. The detour adds roughly 10 to 14 days to a voyage from Asia to Europe and approximately $1 million in additional fuel and operational costs per trip. By early 2024, traffic through the Suez Canal had fallen by more than 50% compared to the previous year. Container vessel traffic dropped by approximately 75%. Egypt's canal revenues fell from a record $10.3 billion in 2023 to approximately $4 billion in 2024, a decline of more than 60%. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi said the disruption had cost Egypt approximately $7 billion in lost revenue. For a country heavily dependent on foreign currency earnings, this was not an accounting loss. It was a macroeconomic shock. The crisis exposed a truth that the Ever Given had only hinted at. The Suez Canal cannot be secured in isolation. It depends on the Red Sea approach to its south, which depends on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the southern end of the Red Sea, which is bordered by Yemen on one side and Djibouti on the other. Yemen has been in civil war since 2015. The Houthis, backed by Iran, control its western coast and possess sufficient military capability to attack ships with missiles and drones from territory the international community cannot easily reach. The world's most important shortcut between east and west has a vulnerability at its southern gate that no amount of naval patrol has thus far been able to eliminate. American and British military forces began striking Houthi launch sites in January 2024. The strikes reduced the frequency of attacks but did not stop them. A multinational naval coalition, Operation Prosperity Guardian, was established to escort ships through the Red Sea. Insurance premiums for vessels willing to attempt the transit reached levels that made the route economically unviable for many operators, regardless of physical risk. The pattern was almost identical to what had played out in the Strait of Hormuz in previous years. Military power can reduce the threat. It cannot eliminate the calculation that makes insurance underwriters unwilling to cover the risk. By mid-2025, some traffic had begun to return to the canal. The Suez Canal Authority reported that transit numbers in the July to October 2025 period were slightly higher than the same period in 2024. But total transit volumes remained far below the levels of 2022 and 2023. And the broader Red Sea crisis showed no clear path to resolution. The Houthis had demonstrated something that every analyst of maritime choke points had long understood in theory. It does not take a great power to disrupt the world's most important trade route. It takes only a relatively small military force operating from ungoverned or contested territory with access to affordable missile and drone technology. The specific goods that stopped flowing tell a story that abstract economic statistics cannot. European car manufacturers, who depended on components manufactured in Asia, found production lines halting as parts failed to arrive on schedule. Coffee prices in European markets rose as shipments from East Africa and Yemen, normally routed through the Red Sea, were delayed by weeks. Norwegian salmon farmers, who exported refrigerated cargo to Asian markets, lost business because the rerouted journey around Africa took too long for perishable goods. Hospitals in Europe that sourced pharmaceutical ingredients from Indian manufacturers faced supply chain disruptions for medications. The Suez Canal carries not simply bulk commodities, but the precise, time-sensitive components of a global economy that has been optimized for speed and just-in-time delivery. When the timing breaks, the optimization collapses. Consider what the Suez Canal means in a single day of normal operation. Approximately $10 billion worth of goods cross the canal every 24 hours. That is roughly $416 million every hour, $7 million every minute. On a quiet Tuesday morning in March, while most of the world is eating breakfast or commuting to work, a convoy of supertankers, container vessels, bulk carriers, and car transporter ships is threading through the desert, carrying crude oil from Saudi Arabia to Rotterdam, refrigerators from Chinese factories to Mediterranean ports, and grain from Ukraine to South Asian markets. The movement is continuous, largely invisible, and utterly essential. The scale is almost impossible to absorb at the level of individual goods. Every container passing through carries its own story. Somewhere in the stack of steel boxes on the deck of a vessel making the northbound transit today, there is children's clothing, machine parts, pharmaceutical ingredients, agricultural chemicals, and consumer electronics. Each of those containers is accounted for somewhere on a spreadsheet, expected at a warehouse, committed to a purchase order. When the transit is delayed, the spreadsheet is wrong. When it is delayed by months, as happened during the Houthi crisis, the spreadsheet becomes meaningless, and the entire logistics system behind it has to be renegotiated from first principles. The people who live along the canal banks have watched this traffic pass for more than a century and a half. In Port Said at the northern entrance, and Suez at the southern end, and in Ismailia at the midpoint, entire communities have been built around the canal's rhythms. Pilots who guide ships through the narrow channel, mechanics who service the vessels at the port facilities, customs officials, tugboat operators, dredging crews who work continuously to maintain the canal's depth against the accumulating sediment of the desert. For them, the canal is not a geopolitical abstraction. It is the economy of their city, the income of their family, the pulse of daily life in a place that would be very different without it. A Suez Canal pilot works a rotation that most professions would find unusual. He boards a vessel at Port Said or at the southern terminal at Suez, guides it through the entire length of the canal over a transit that takes between 13 and 16 hours, depending on speed and convoy position, and then returns by road or by ferry to do it again. He knows every turn, every depth change, every potentially awkward moment in the channel from memory. He knows which sections require particular attention in crosswinds, which approach angles work best for the largest vessels, and how to read the behavior of a ship in the narrow confines of the desert ditch in ways that its own captain, arriving in these waters for the first time, cannot. Arriving in these waters for the first time, cannot. Arriving in the Stintrial, there are approximately 800 licensed Suez Canal pilots, and their collective expertise is as much a part of the canal's infrastructure as the concrete walls and the dredging equipment. Arriving Penelon is also, in a profound sense, the autobiography of modern Egypt. Arriving Penelon, it was built with Egyptian labor and Egyptian suffering under French and British direction. It was owned by European shareholders for most of its first century. My poem de multi-bautis de Saint-Prétenche. Its nationalization was the defining act of Egypt's post-colonial identity, the moment that made Nasser the most celebrated Arab leader of the 20th century, and announced to the world that the age of European imperial control over other nations' strategic assets was ending. Its revenues fund the Egyptian state today. Its vulnerability, as demonstrated by the Houthi crisis, is a vulnerability that Egypt itself cannot fully address because the threat comes from a war in a neighboring country that Egypt did not start and cannot end. Egypt is a country of more than 100 million people, the most populous in the Arab world, with an economy that has long struggled to generate enough foreign currency to service its external debts and import the food its population requires. The canal's revenues, in a normal year, are not simply a convenient supplement to the national budget. They are a structural necessity. Hamas 1. When Egyptian President Sisi said the Houthi crisis had cost Egypt $7 billion in lost canal revenues in 2024, he was describing damage that went far beyond a line item in a spreadsheet. Hamas 1. Egypt had to negotiate additional emergency financing from the International Monetary Fund and from Gulf state partners to manage the shortfall. A country that cannot control the security of the waterway on which its economic stability depends is a country whose sovereignty over its most important asset is, in the most practical sense, incomplete. The Suez Canal will almost certainly remain open for the foreseeable future. The political will to keep it functioning exists on virtually every side. Egypt depends on its revenues. Shipping companies depend on its shortcut. Consumers across Europe and Asia depend on the lower prices that the shorter route makes possible. Even the powers that have threatened or disrupted the canal in the past have generally recognized that prolonged closure serves nobody's interests, including their own. And yet the canal's story is also a story about how quickly the world's most essential infrastructure can become contested territory. The canal sits at the junction of 3 continents and within reach of several of the most unstable regions on Earth. To its south lies Yemen, in a civil war that has now lasted more than a decade. To its east lies the broader Middle East, where conflicts have repeatedly spilled into the waterways and shipping lanes that connect the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. To its north lies the Mediterranean, where the geopolitics of energy, migration, and great power rivalry intersect in ways that occasionally threaten to spill southward. The canal cannot be separated from the political environment that surrounds it. It never could. Its entire history is a demonstration of that fact. The deeper problem is structural and may be impossible to solve. The canal was built in a specific location because geography demanded it. The Isthmus of Suez is where it is. The Red Sea is where it is. Yemen is where it is. No engineering project, however ambitious, can change those facts. The canal can be widened and deepened. It can be equipped with new traffic management systems and expanded to allow larger vessels. Egypt can improve its port facilities and reduce transit times. But the approach corridor, the Red Sea funnel that feeds traffic to the canal's southern entrance, will always run between the coasts of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at its southern end will always be within missile range of Yemeni territory. That is the geography. It existed before the canal was built. It will exist long after any particular political crisis has been resolved. But the canal's history is also a history of unexpected closures, sudden crises, and the humbling of great powers by geography. Every time the world has decided that the canal is simply a permanent feature of the global economic landscape, something has happened to remind everyone that it is not. It is a man-made structure built across a desert, maintained by constant dredging, dependent on stable politics along the approaches to both its ends, and capable of disrupting the entire global economy when something goes wrong. One ship, the entire world, watching and waiting and largely helpless. That is what the Suez Canal is. That is what it has always been. The shortest path between East and West, the autobiography of a century of global power, and the reminder that the most important things in the world are almost always the things we only truly notice when they stop working. Somewhere in the desert south of the Mediterranean, a convoy of ships is moving through the canal right now. They carry the goods that fill the shelves, fuel the machines, and keep the lights on across 2 continents. The pilots are watching the channel markers. The engines are running at reduced speed. The desert stretches away on both sides, brown and flat and ancient, indifferent to the enormity of what passes through it. And the world, as it almost always does, is not watching at all.
No.
It never truly does, until the day it has absolutely no choice.